about it to the very end. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, I miss him. Sucks.
What's that? Oh, yeah. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
Well, we always make you go first.
What's that?
We always make you go first. I'm
We don't have to say as much.
Oh, okay. I'm happy to. Whatever.
Okay, I can. That's fine. Hey, good morning, everybody. So we are in this bridge week with fiscal cutoff. So policy committees have finished doing their work for the first half of session, and now we're deep in hearings in Ways and Means, and then spending time on the floor each morning, headed toward lots of floor action in the next couple of weeks. In Ways and Means, I think the major theme that we have seen is what kind of difficult decisions we're going to have to make in terms of the budget. So we had a big hearing yesterday on the proposed reductions in Fair Start for Kids and early learning and childcare, and heard some really wrenching testimony from the real human beings who are going to be affected by the cuts that we are likely going to have to make. And that ripples through all the budget and real human beings who are going to be affected by the budget situation. But we remain committed to scrubbing as hard as we can to find all the efficiencies and savings that we can before we start talking about how to solve the rest of the budget problem. So that is the focus for us this week in Ways. That notwithstanding, I think we have made some good progress on both education funding. We'll see those bills for public school funding come out of Ways on Thursday, and then we've made good progress both in the House and on the floor, and then we'll see in the later in the week in Ways and Means on some additional housing supply bills. So that's our main focus for right now.
Thanks, Joe Fitzgibbon, House Majority Leader. Our biggest focus this year, of course, this week included, is on balancing the state budget, particularly the operating budget. We rolled out a website to highlight the all cuts proposal that Governor Inslee produced. It was required by law to produce, including some really painful cuts to things that would really impact Washingtonians, including eliminating Medicaid kidney dialysis services, including eliminating Medicaid pharmaceutical benefit, Medicaid family planning services. Of course, those are not cuts that we want to make. Those are not cuts that Governor Inslee wanted to make, but in a no new revenue scenario, those are the kind of cuts that are on the table. Of course, that challenge is compounded by the fact that yesterday we saw the U.S. House pass a budget resolution calling for $900 billion in cuts to Medicaid across our country. Those cuts would compound our budget problem, but more importantly, they would put at risk the lives of our constituents, particularly our poorest constituents, particularly constituents in the poorest parts of our state, like Central Washington. So really concerned to see that budget resolution pass through Congress, and really hope that as they move into the next step of the federal budget process, that they don't jeopardize people's lives by kicking them off of health care, which we're seeing every day what the impacts of that might be on our own constituents. At the national level, you hear Republicans saying, oh, we can pass massive tax cuts and just not worry about our budget deficit. We have the same kind of cavalier attitude from Republican leadership here in Olympia, where they say that, if we only just rolled back state spending to where it was a couple of years ago, that our budget would be fine. Well, the places where we've increased spending, they're proposing additional spending. So where we've increased resources for special education, for kids with special needs, and educators teaching kids with special needs over the last few years, we see Republicans supporting, billions of dollars in increases for special ed funding, increases that we would love to do, but that they are saying we should roll back the increases we did over the last 2 years, but then do billions in new spending this year. We just think they're talking about out of both sides of their mouth on that. They say let's roll back spending to where it was 2 years ago for nursing home rates, but then you have, on House Bill 1555 to increase nursing home rates. 6 Republican co-sponsors of that bill, including the ranking Republican on the Healthcare Committee. So we're really not sure what cuts they want to see, because they say both roll back spending to where it was a few years ago, but also increase spending in all the same places that you increased in the recent budget. So that's part of our challenge here. But that said, we are hard at work on finding the cuts to the state operating budget that we think are least likely to harm the people that we represent.
On the Republican media earlier yesterday, Senator Gildon said that the actual budget deficit of the next 4 years is $6.7 billion, not the anywhere from 7 to 12, 14 billion that we've heard. He said that he's actually gotten a line-by-line accounting of that from nonpartisan Ways and Means staff. And he said that he's yet to see a different accounting to explain for a supposed much larger deficit. Have you gone to Ways and Means nonpartisan staff and seen a line by line of what the projected deficit is, and how you respond to his comments?
When you're in the majority, you're actually responsible for writing the budget. So unlike just vague numbers that you can pull out of the air, we are working very closely with nonpartisan staff, going line by line through the budget, and that process has been ongoing for 3 months now. We're through what they call round 2 of that process, and the actual number is around $12 billion over 4 years. That's the number that we're working with, and I think there's a little bit of what I would say a major difference between what Senator Gildon is assuming and what we're assuming in the $12 billion is what happens to the negotiated increases for state employees. If you just assume that we can have state employees make 0% more for the next 2 years, then probably it's closer to $7 billion. But I think that's still probably not quite correct. Mm-hmm. But it would reduce the $12 billion if we assumed that we could just stiff all of our employees. In the actual world, where you have to run the state and attract and retain good people, you can't, and you have an inflation environment where eggs are $10.39 for an 18-pack or $8 for a dozen. You can't tell your employees that you can't pay them any more for the next 2 years.
Why not? That's what the private sector's doing.
That is not what the private sector is doing. I can tell you in my other job, I'm in charge of HR, among other things. We just got through a round of having to pay 4% increases per year, for the year, for our roughly 3,000 employees. And we're in the middle of negotiating collective bargaining agreements with our union employees, who are getting much larger increases, more along the lines of 10%. That's what's going on in the actual economy, not 0% increases.
In terms of progressive revenue, I'm curious to see what options you're considering and how much of a priority taxing storage units is.
Yeah, I think you probably are starting to see in our finance committee, and there's a plethora of kind of options that are out there. Certainly, I think taxing storage units is one of those. It wouldn't be the largest revenue source, but there is really no taxation of those right now. So I think other than regular property tax, like everyone who owns property has. I think that's one of our governing principles is if we are considering revenue, that we would like it to be progressive, because we would like to continue to move on our continuum of moving away from being the most tax regressive, tax unfair state in the nation and move toward a much more fair tax model. So that will be a high priority for us as we look at possible revenue options. But in the end, as Majority Leader Fitzgibbon said, we'll have to make whatever choices we make based on thinking about what services Washingtonians will lose. So I think we want to make sure that folks aren't losing health care. We want to, we're going to probably have to slow down the growth of our investments in child care, and we know that's very important to people. So we'll always be trying to balance those kinds of things as we're making our final decisions.
And it's always an equation when you take a look at revenue and what we're looking at in Ways and Means. We took a look at expanding working family tax credit because you want to make sure, again, it's about balancing the tax code, who's paying and for what. I'm very excited about making sure that we're talking about excluding primary residents from property taxes. And so it is really about the tax burden on the lowest and middle class in this state. And so when we talk about taxes, you have to talk about what's going on the other side of the equation, where we are giving money back to individuals who are at the poorest level, middle class level, to make sure that in Washington it is affordable for everyone, and that we are making sure that everyone is paying their share fare.
You put out your potential cut list, at least based on Governor Inslee's proposal. Tomorrow we're going to hear potentially from Governor Ferguson what his 6% cuts would look like. I know he's been meeting with some of you on the budget. Have you got a sense of where he is going? He's talked about taxes being a last resort. That's not what we're hearing from you. How do you convince him that perhaps taxes will have to be part of the budget solution this year?
I don't think that we're misaligned with him on that. Taxes are our last resort. We're not. That's not the first place we go. That's why we have spent countless hours over the course of this session and before the session going line by line through the budget, identifying places that we thought we could make cuts that, avoid as much as possible harm to the most vulnerable people in our state, kids in our public schools, developmentally disabled people, elderly people receiving care from the state. We're very intentional about trying to find cuts that we don't think are harmful, and we understand that's the exercise that the governor and OFM and the executive branch agencies have been going through. We're scheduled to meet with OFM today to get more detail about what those cuts they've identified are. We hope that they've identified some things that we haven't yet identified. I expect there will be some overlap between the cuts that we're already, in each chamber planning to incorporate into our own budgets. It would be very helpful, and I think it will be very helpful if we see cuts that we haven't yet identified that we don't think hurt the people that we are trying to not hurt.
Has there been any? How much back and forth or collaboration has there been between you all and the governor's office as the governor's office has gone about, coming up with their cutting plan? I mean, have you had any input on how they've structured the cuts, or are you really proceeding on two different tracks?
I think that we're about at the point where those tracks converge. I think they wanted to get through both first the agencies, then OFM, then the governor to make these decisions and put them before the legislature, and I don't think we wanted to insert ourselves into that process. But I think their input and their suggestions as far as where cuts are achievable is something that we're happy that we're going to be receiving. But no, we've been respecting their executive branch process to come up with that list.
During yesterday's Republican media availability, I asked about the No Revenue Budget website. Representative Chris Corey, he effectively said that the website highlights how much Democrats mismanaged state finances in previous years. What are your thoughts on that? What's your response?
I mean, I guess that's a luxury that you can say things like that when you're in the minority, right? So, I mean, if you look at our past budgets, their amendments on the floor as we pass them, if we pass them off the floor of the House, are for more spending on things, not less. Things as very much like what Majority Leader Fitzgibbon has talked about: long-term care spending, child care spending, spending in health care and Medicaid, spending on schools. So that's a luxury that you have, I guess, when you're not responsible for producing a balanced budget, is you can say, oh, you should be spending more on these things, and then critique the spending of more on those things. That's not it's not a kind of a useful critique. We're certainly very open to hearing from Republicans if they have specific ideas of where things should be reduced and how we should go about doing that. We have invited that kind of feedback, as has the governor. And so we will continue to be open to that, but it's very hard when you feel like you're hearing people talk out of both sides of their mouth about what ought to happen.
And I'll say on our side, the experience is just a little bit different working with the Senate Republicans. They are and have been in the room at every stage. They've participated in the budget development over the last few years, and that's why they voted for the budget.
So in terms of cuts and healthcare, I'm curious on the bill regarding healthcare for immigrants. It didn't ultimately receive a hearing, but I know in previous sessions it was funded through provisos. So I'm curious on what direction that bill could go this year, or the funding for that issue could go for this year.
I think we are going to have an awful lot of things that we would love to be able to do for people that may or may not happen. We don't know the answer to that yet. There are real consequences to the budget shortfall that we have, and we're going to have really difficult decisions. A lot of good new ideas that people had are going to be left on the cutting room floor in Senate Ways and Means and House Appropriations because we have to govern. We have to balance a budget, unlike the Congress. And in the end, we're just going to have to make those decisions about how to spend, where to spend, and where not to spend.
I'll just say access to health care is one thing that is very much related to what happens at the federal level. And given what's happening there, I think, unfortunately, there are going to be more and more people who are going to be uninsured, and that is going to lead to them utilizing a lot more expensive services as they end up going into emergency rooms instead of trying to access preventative care. So I will tell you that I'm holding my breath for the healthcare disaster that's going to descend upon us next year, whenever the feds continue to cut Medicaid and continue to take away resources from the poorest of the poor in America.
I have
another question, but go ahead.
Flavored vapes, is that a balance because there would be a hit to revenue? Speaker Jenkins, I know health is a big concern for you. We're talking about youth. That's sort of who this bill supposedly is trying to protect. Where do you see that issue going? Because there would be some pushback there. I know there's a revenue bill that might offset that, but where do you see flavored vapes going, and is that a tough one for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's obviously one of the things that you would consider is the revenue loss. For me as a public health person, right, I think flavored vapes are completely targeted to youth, as we saw flavored tobacco was completely targeted to youth. So, high desire to do whatever we can to stop youth from being from getting addicted to nicotine in that way. We should maybe continue to increase taxation there, because we saw with tobacco that when we did that really, it has a increase in taxation on tobacco and vaping products has a much more significant impact on youth, and having youth not begin the use of those products than anything else you can do, almost. But we're going to have to, as Senator Peterson said, balancing a lot of different issues this year.
I'll just say, these are the tough decisions we have to make, because we do know that banning flavored products, for vaping, is the way that we should be going. It is better for the health care of our youth. And, I would love to be able to vote for that, but we have to take a look at the realities. And this is where taking a look at where we're raising revenue and how that's impacting people, again, comes into the equation. And like I said, it is an equation. You take a look at who you're benefiting, who is paying the tax, and what the end result is going to be. And I'll just add, I mean, these are the tough decisions we've been making for the last few years. And you still have Washington with a AAA bond rating, rated one of the best places to live and work and play. And so I think we're going to continue going forward with those same values and making sure that Washington still continues to be the best place to live, work, and play. And, you know, we're hearing from families that are moving here from different states because they have trans kids and can't live in Texas anymore, or have concerns about access to health care. It is astounding to hear how people all across the country are actually struggling and are scared about what's happening at the federal level. And in these times, it is states like Washington that are a beacon of hope for the rest of the country as they see the disaster that is the federal government right now.
I want to ask about the testimony of Secretary of State Hobbs the other day on the bill dubbed by critics as the initiative killer. Are you swayed? Are those who were supporting the legislation swayed at all by the fact that he got up there and said this is a really, really bad idea?
We have lots of ideas that are in front of us that cost money and are going to be really tough this year, regardless of their merit. And, you know, I think the policy debate is one thing that happened in the state government committee, and I think there was compelling testimony there about the ways that the process has been abused and is not consistent with the constitutional requirements about making sure that we have that number of electors. On the other hand, our job in Ways and Means is to listen to the very real cost of verifying all of those addresses, which is the primary thing that the secretaries of state were testifying about. So it's yet another example of the difficult problem that we're going to have in terms of trying to reconcile what resources we have and not being able to do all of the spending that we might otherwise want to.
So I sense that the bill might be dead from your perspective this year?
I think Senator Robinson will be publishing her list of bills that can move out of Ways and Means within the next day or so.
Senator Peterson, I just want to follow up on when you were talking about the shortfall figures. So, I mean, you're saying, if I was following correctly, you're working off the assumption that there's about a $7 billion deficit, and then another $5 billion is tied to.
No, it's not that much. I'm saying our number is $12 billion. If Senator Gildon is saying 6.7 or 7 billion, a good chunk of that $5 billion difference is what you do with the employees. It's both the collective bargaining agreements and then the other not represented employees that we have in the state government. But I don't think that I don't.
But not the whole $5 billion.
No. It's not the whole $5 billion. And Representative Fitzgibbon, do you know? I think it's more.
There's PEP benefits in it.
Debt service. So if we're going to pass a capital budget, there are costs that are not included in that lower number. But it's not just the contracts, but it's compensation.
But guess what? The Republicans will want to pass a capital budget. So that will mean another few $100 million that gets added to that. So you can make that number sound like it's a lot smaller, and then when you actually have to pass 3 budgets and get out of town, it turns out it's not 6.7 billion. It's closer to 12.
And I would just say that's surprising to me to hear that, because when I was on a panel with Senator Braun just before session started, and he pretty much agreed when I said 12 billion. He said, yes, everybody kind of agrees. It's 12 billion. We might not agree with how you handle contracts in the same way and some other benefits, but yeah, so that's surprising to me to hear that Senator Gildon was saying something different.
I wanted to ask about housing. There was some conversation with the Republican media bill yesterday about housing legislation. Obviously, they don't like the rent limits bill 1217. So I just wanted to ask sort of what the status is of conversations around that legislation, and also sort of what the story is in your view around housing bills this year to address housing needs.
We have dozens of bills to address the cost of housing and the housing shortage from every possible angle. We passed Representative Barkis's lot splitting bill out of appropriations. At the same time, just yesterday, we passed Representative Dewar's bill to relax certain unnecessary local regulations around housing construction, and the Republicans all voted against that. They voted against making standardized setbacks and parking requirements and minimum unit sizes for affordable housing. They all unanimously voted against this bill to allow more diversity of housing types to reduce housing construction costs. So that's okay. You know, we're in the majority and we're going to pass bills, whether they're Democratic or Republican bills. I do wish that we had a little bit more interest from the Republicans in voting for Democratic ideas when it comes to addressing the housing shortage and dealing with housing supply. We have the lot splitting bill. We have Representative Dewar's bill. We have accessory dwelling unit bills. I know that there's bills in the Senate. I believe the Senate passed their parking bill, Senator Bateman's bill. I know there's condo liability legislation that Representative Taylor has been working on. That's a topic that has been, we have had many bills on that over the years. We've had many bills on permitting, on environmental review, on zoning and development regulations, and we still will. And we also think, and this is probably where there's a more partisan disagreement, that we should also not allow unlimited year-over-year rent increases as people currently experience. So we will have a broad array of housing strategies moving forward, and I guess it is disappointing to me that the Republicans talk out of both sides of their mouth on this topic and only support Republican ideas when it comes to housing supply.
Yeah,
At least the House Republicans.
Yeah,
Yes.
our experience has been a little bit different. Both the parking bill, 5184, and Senator Solomon's bill about the elevator size, essentially allowing more infill development, passed out with large bipartisan majorities and majorities of both caucuses voting for those bills. We have another bill by Senator Bateman around GMA work that is in Ways and Means, and I think could have bipartisan support. We're certainly hoping for that, and we're in regular conversation with the Republicans. Now, another idea that has come from the Building Industry Association of Washington and the realtors is this grand bargain on simple majority for school bonds that would include a prohibition on school district impact fees going forward. That has the possibility both to increase school funding dramatically for some of these districts that can't pass bond measures right now because a 60% majority is required, and to lower housing costs, right? And so I think that's very exciting. Our caucus is really united around that. I think we're hoping, and BIAW and the realtors are working hard on trying to get Republican support because we need 3 of their votes to be able to pass the constitutional amendment. So we're fingers crossed that that's something that we'll be able to do.
I'll just add, just kind of conceptually, the things that we have, I think, agreed to work on in a bipartisan way over the last number of years with regard to housing is creating housing stability, increasing supply, and making sure there are strong supports. What we have heard from Republicans in the House is only discussion of the supply side, and mostly focused on their ideas of the supply side. But, when you look at, for example, renter stability and some things that we've done there with regard to eviction reform and the bill on rent stabilization this year, I mean, the research out there tells us that it's people being unable to pay their rent is one of the biggest contributors to homelessness in the state of Washington. So we have to address that, but there's little interest in that piece. And there's, interest in some ways on the supply side. And even in the support side, the Housing Trust Fund, we, tend to hear a fair number of critiques. Now, which is okay. We can always kind of do better with that fund, but that's where you're trying to help the supports so that you can build more housing, right? For the lowest income people in the state. I think that one of the things that we also see in housing is any legislation that we pass in the investments that we make, it takes more than a minute to build housing. So those investments take a couple years to see the results of those. And we're seeing that a lot in the Housing Trust Fund in terms of how many builds are starting to happen. Likewise, I think the fact that we've passed over 25 supply side bills on every topic imaginable over the last 2 years, we're starting to see that also have an impact. So I think we're doing well. There's more things to be done, and there's no magical solution in any one of those areas that if we just did one thing, it would fix that.
On the potential grant market that Senator Peterson just raised regarding school bonds, is there similar support for that idea in the House?
We think it's a very interesting idea. We, of course, would need bipartisan support in both chambers for that. And so, we'll be interested to hear from our colleagues across the aisle.
So in terms of the wage replacement or the UI benefits for immigrants without legal authorization, I'm curious on how much of a priority it is this year. I know it's been heard in previous sessions, but has failed to move forward.
That is an idea that I know has very broad support in our caucus. And folks have been working on that for a number of years. I think that the proposal has been refined and has addressed a lot of the downsides that were identified in past sessions. I do not think this is likely a year when we're going to see a lot of new programs or benefits make it through the process. And I think, unfortunately, that is the case with the UI proposal for undocumented Washingtonians. So I think that the work that has gone into it will bear fruit in future years, but this is just not the year that we're going to see a lot of new benefits given our context.
Does free school meals kind of fall into that same category of good idea, but not necessarily the right time right now?
Yes.
Yeah, the Friday is the deadline for that bill to pass out of House Appropriations. It has received a hearing in House Appropriations. Given the number of competing demands we have, it's a challenge, but nothing in House Appropriations is dead until after Friday.
There's a bill that's being heard in the Senate today that would move the state's reserves into the general fund. The treasurer is already signed an con on that, to my understanding. He's obviously not supporting that, so I'm curious where support from both of your caucuses lies to that bill.
We have a significant cash crunch in the first year of the next biennium, and I think that it will be part of the Senate's budget plan to use that money and ultimately to pay it back before the end of the 4 years.
Likewise. For us.
Do Democrats have the votes to make that change, like, without Republican support? I'm not sure if that's what
Yes.
Oh.
On free school meals, if the bill dies, is there any way to revisit that in the budget process without the vehicle of the bill that would lapse this week? And is there any middle ground, I guess, where you could maybe go from where things are now with the free school meals program, but not 100% and kind of split the difference?
If the bill doesn't pass out of House Appropriations on Friday, then it's not passing for the year. I would say that the middle ground is probably paying for the costs of the existing free school meals programs that we've already legislated in previous years. There's about a $30 million increase in the cost of paying for what the school meal policies that we've passed in previous years. And we very much hope to be funding that as part of our budget that makes it into law this year. That's what is probably the middle ground.
And we've been increasing school meals over the last few years, but at the end of the day, what we're talking about is food insecurity. And so it's food insecurity statewide on how we're addressing it. Taking a look at, can people use their benefits to access farmers markets, to access other opportunities for them to get healthy food. So, I love concentrating on children, but you have to talk about food insecurity as a state. And really, again, going back to what's going to happen nationally with food insecurity. So it is a much larger conversation. And talking about food insecurity, our school meals is one part of it. But you've got to take a look at the rest of the benefits surrounding our very poor people across the entire state.
Yeah, if you look at the Book 1 budget that Governor Inslee put out, it would eliminate funding for example, summer lunches for kids who are out of school. And so there's just a lot of issues related to, but not just everybody, but children in particular, on food insecurity that we're going to try to address. I think too, I'm a little bit conscious of the fact that the governor in his inaugural address was very clear that he didn't want parsing out of bills where the costs went beyond the 4-year outlook. And so he spoke pretty strongly about that, like I think he used veto language. So doing a small portion and trying to do it over, more than 4 years is not something that, at least in his inaugural comments, would have probably, we don't think would have been well received.
The last thing I'll say is that the congressional budget resolution that passed yesterday also contemplates hundreds of billions of dollars in cuts in SNAP benefits, which, yet again, one of the ways in which the Republicans at the federal levels desire for deep tax cuts for the wealthy could play its way out in terms of hungrier people here in Washington.
Can I follow up on the reserves legislation that we were just talking about? Sorry to ping pong, but when you're talking about the uncertainty at the federal level of, a third of the state's budget is federal funding, cuts could come to programs like Medicare, Medicaid. How do you reconcile, taking that much money out of the budget savings account, that idea, with the risk of uncertainty at the federal level? I mean, is that risky, or I guess what's the thinking behind that? If the state runs into an emergency and there's nothing in the savings account, I'm just, how are you thinking about that?
We're in an emergency already, and the reason we have a budget stabilization account is for situations like the one that we're in today.
Yeah, I guess I'd also say that although it's important for us and will help us to avoid deeper cuts that would hurt people, the amount in the budget stabilization account pales compared to the amounts of money that we get from the federal government. If the federal government really begins to cut off Medicaid funding for our people, then we're talking about a completely different conversation that is not going to be remedied by having $1.7 billion extra sitting in the budget stabilization account. Those amounts would get wiped out in a couple months.
Anything else? Thank you.